In 1956, a widow in rural Iowa fed herself on pennies a day. Using dump-and-bake suppers, her mother taught her during the Depression. She never measured, never fussed, just dumped canned goods and raw rice into a pan and let the oven do the work. Her cupboard held nothing fancy: beans, day-old bread, a sack of potatoes. A single supper cost her 10 cents, sometimes less. While neighbors stood at hot stoves, stirring and watching, she assembled meals, sitting down, and walked away. Today, most people think cooking for one means expensive meal kits or frozen dinners. The truth is smarter. These 60 forgotten dump-and-bake suppers cost pennies per serving and required almost no effort. Real 1950s seniors made things modern kitchens have completely forgotten. Let's count down the 60 cheap dump-and-bake suppers that kept seniors fed when every penny mattered. In the 1950s, ground beef was the great stretcher. A single pound could feed a family of 4 if you knew how to work it, and seniors living alone could make it last nearly a week. Budget beef and rice skillet required nothing more than a half-pound of ground beef, 1 cup of white rice, 2 cups of water, a diced onion, and salt. You browned the beef in a cast-iron skillet, scattered the raw rice over the top, poured in the water, added the onion, covered it tightly, and let it simmer for 20 minutes until the rice absorbed every drop of liquid and every bit of beef flavor. The result was a complete meal in one pan, soft and savory, and filling enough to silence hunger and simple enough to make with arthritic hands. The entire dish cost roughly 15 cents in 1956 and reheated perfectly the next day. Seniors who made this knew that fancy cooking was a luxury, but eating well was a necessity. Hot dish was the Midwestern word for casserole, and this version came straight from the lean years of the 1930s, carried forward into the 1950s by women who never forgot what hunger felt like. Depression-style macaroni. Hot dish combined a half-pound of ground beef, 2 cups of dried elbow macaroni, 1 can of tomato sauce, and a handful of salt in a single baking dish. You dumped everything in raw, added 2 cups of water, stirred once, covered it with foil, and baked it at 350 degrees for 40 minutes. The macaroni cooked directly in the tomato and beef juices, absorbing flavor and creating a thick, saucy consistency that needed no draining, no boiling, no extra pots. A senior could assemble this in under 5 minutes and walk away while the oven did the work. The cost per serving hovered around 12 cents, and the leftovers kept for days. This was survival cooking disguised as comfort food. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Across the Southwest, tomatoes and rice formed the backbone of penny-pinching suppers, and Texas tomato rice bake was the simplest expression of that partnership. You took 1 cup of long-grain white rice, 1 can of diced tomatoes with their juice, a chopped onion, a diced green bell pepper if you had one, and a half-pound of ground beef. Everything went into a greased casserole dish, raw, no browning, no pre-cooking. Then you poured in 1 cup of water, covered it tightly, and baked it at 375 degrees for 50 minutes. The rice steamed in the tomato liquid, the beef rendered its fat into the grains, and the vegetables softened into the mixture, creating a dish that tasted faintly Spanish and deeply satisfying. A senior could make this on a Tuesday afternoon and eat from it until Thursday. The cost was negligible, maybe 18 cents per serving, and the cleanup was a single baking dish. No skill required, just patience. One-pan hamburger supper was the dish you made when the cupboard was nearly bare and payday was still 3 days away. It required a half-pound of ground beef, 3 medium potatoes sliced thin, 1 onion sliced into rings, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup, and a half cup of milk. You layered everything raw into a greased skillet or baking dish. potatoes on the bottom, raw beef crumbled over them, onion rings scattered across. Then the soup and milk whisked together and poured over the top, covered tightly with foil. It baked at 350 degrees for an hour until the potatoes were fork tender and the beef had cooked through, creating its own gravy from the rendered fat and soup. The result was hearty, filling, and required zero stovetop work. A senior with shaky hands or limited strength could assemble this sitting down, and the cost per serving was roughly 14 cents. This was the meal that said, "I'm still taking care of myself." Farmhouse beef and potato bake was the supper that farm wives made when the men were out in the fields and dinner needed to be ready without supervision. It was also the supper that elderly women living alone made when standing at the stove felt like too much work. You took a half-pound of ground beef, 4 medium potatoes sliced into thin rounds, 1 diced onion, a can of tomato soup, and a half-cup of water, everything layered into a greased casserole dish. Potatoes first, raw beef crumbled over them, onions scattered, soup and water mixed and poured over the top. No browning, no pre-cooking, no fuss. Covered with foil, it baked at 350 degrees for 75 minutes until the potatoes were soft and the beef had created a rich, tomatoey gravy. The dish cost about 16 cents per serving and tasted better the second day. Seniors who made this understood that simplicity was not laziness, it was wisdom. These first 5 dump-and-bake suppers show how 1950s seniors turned ground beef, potatoes, and canned goods into complete meals without standing at the stove. No measuring, no browning, no complicated steps, just dump, bake, and eat. Penny-pinching cooking that kept people fed and independent. Layered supper casserole earned its name from the way ingredients stacked neatly in the baking dish, each one cooking in the steam and juices of the others. A half-pound of ground beef went on the bottom, followed by 1 cup of uncooked white rice, 1 can of kidney beans drained, 1 can of diced tomatoes with juice, and a sliced onion. You poured in 1 cup of water, sprinkled salt and chili powder over the top, covered it tightly with foil, and baked it at 350 degrees for 90 minutes. The rice absorbed the tomato liquid, the beans added heft, and the beef flavored everything from below. The result was a complete, balanced meal in one dish, protein, starch, and vegetables all together. A senior could eat from this for 3 days, and the cost per serving was around 11 cents. Church ladies brought this to potlucks because it traveled well, but widows made it at home because it required almost no effort and wasted nothing. Church basement noodle bake got its name from the thousands of church suppers where it appeared in aluminum pans, fed crowds of 50, and never left a single serving behind. At home, a senior could scale it down to feed one for days. You took 2 cups of dried egg noodles, a half-pound of ground beef, 1 can of tomato sauce, 1 cup of water, and a handful of shredded cheddar cheese. Everything except the cheese went into a greased baking dish raw, stirred once, covered tightly with foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes. 5 minutes before it was done, you uncovered it, sprinkled cheese across the top, and let it melt into a golden layer. The noodles cooked directly in the beef and tomato juices, creating a cohesive, saucy dish that tasted faintly Italian and deeply comforting. The cost per serving was about 13 cents, and the leftovers reheated beautifully. This was the casserole that proved you didn't need fancy ingredients to eat well. Cornmeal. Crust beef pie was the poor man's pot pie, a dish that stretched a tiny amount of meat into something that felt substantial and celebratory. You started with a half-pound of ground beef, then 1 can of corn drained, 1 diced onion, and a can of tomato sauce mixed together in a greased baking dish. For the crust, you stirred together 1 cup of cornmeal, 1 egg, 1 cup of milk, a tablespoon of melted butter, and a pinch of salt, then poured that batter directly over the raw beef mixture. It baked uncovered at 375 degrees for 45 minutes until the cornmeal topping puffed up and turned golden brown. The result was a two-layered dish: savory beef and corn on the bottom, a slightly sweet cake-like cornbread crust on top. A senior could cut this into squares and eat from it all week. The cost per serving was around 15 cents, and the combination of textures made it far more interesting than plain ground beef. Pickleburger casserole was one of those dishes that sounded strange until you tasted it, and then you understood why it had survived in church cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards for decades. You took a half-pound of ground beef, 2 cups of dried egg noodles, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup, a half cup of milk, a half cup of diced dill pickles with a little of their juice, and a handful of shredded cheddar cheese. Everything except the cheese went into a greased baking dish, raw, stirred together, covered tightly with foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 40 minutes. Then you uncovered it, sprinkled cheese on top, and baked for 5 more minutes. The pickles added a tangy brightness that cut through the richness of the beef and soup, creating a flavor that was oddly addictive. A senior could make this for pennies, roughly 14 cents per serving, and it reheated without losing its character. This was the kind of recipe that proved Depression-era cooks were far more creative than they're given credit for. Thrifty stroganoff bake was what happened when someone who remembered real beef stroganoff, the kind made with sour cream and mushrooms and served over buttered noodles, tried to recreate it on a budget so tight it squeaked. You took a half-pound of ground beef, 2 cups of dried egg noodles, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup, a half cup of sour cream, a half cup of water, and a pinch of paprika. Everything went into a greased casserole dish, raw, stirred together, covered tightly with foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes. The noodles cooked in the beef juices and soup. The sour cream added a faint tanginess, and the paprika gave it a pale rust color that looked almost fancy. The result was nothing like the original, but it was warm, filling, and cost about 12 cents per serving. Seniors who made this weren't trying to fool anyone. They were just trying to eat something that tasted good and reminded them of better days. These 10 dump-and-bake suppers prove that 1950s seniors didn't need culinary school to eat well on pennies. They layered, they dumped, they covered, they baked. No standing, no stirring, no complicated techniques, just smart, practical cooking that kept bellies full and dignity intact. Pineapple luncheon meat bake was the dish that turned canned spam or treat into something almost celebratory. You took 1 12-ounce can of luncheon meat sliced into thick rounds, 1 cup of uncooked white rice, 1 can of crushed pineapple with its juice, a tablespoon of soy sauce, and a cup of water. Everything layered into a greased baking dish, rice on the bottom, luncheon meat slices arranged on top, pineapple spooned over, liquids poured in. Covered tightly with foil, it baked at 350 degrees for 50 minutes until the rice absorbed the sweet salty liquid and the meat caramelized slightly at the edges. The pineapple cut through the saltiness of the meat, and the soy sauce added a faint umami depth that made the whole thing taste more complex than it was. A senior could make this for about 18 cents per serving, and it was one of the few ways to make canned meat feel like a treat rather than a compromise. Sausage and bean hot dish was the meal you made when you had 1 can of Vienna sausages, 1 can of pork and beans, and a desperate need for something hot and filling. You dumped the beans into a greased baking dish, drained the sausages, and nestled them into the beans, diced 1 onion, and scattered it over the top, then drizzled a tablespoon of molasses or brown sugar across everything. That was it. Uncovered, it baked at 375 degrees for 30 minutes until the beans bubbled and the sausages browned slightly. The molasses caramelized into the bean liquid, creating a sweet, savory glaze that elevated the humble ingredients into something that tasted deliberate. A senior could make this for under 10 cents per serving, and the whole thing could be assembled in under 3 minutes. This was the definition of dump and bake. No thought, no skill, just survival turned into supper. Corned beef skillet supper was the dish that turned a single can of corned beef hash into 2 full meals. You took 1 15-ounce can of corned beef hash, 3 medium potatoes sliced thin, 1 diced onion, a half cup of milk, and a handful of shredded cheese. You layered the raw potato slices into a greased cast-iron skillet, crumbled the hash over them, scattered the onion, poured the milk over the top, covered it tightly with foil, and baked it at 375 degrees for an hour. 5 minutes before it was done, you uncovered it, sprinkled cheese across the top, and let it melt into a golden crust. The potatoes soaked up the savory fat from the hash. The milk kept everything moist, and the cheese added richness. A senior could make this for about 20 cents per serving and eat from it for 2 days. This was the meal that proved canned goods could still feel like real cooking. Noodle and spread casserole used one of the most maligned ingredients in the American pantry, potted meat spread. But in the 1950s, when seniors were stretching every nickel, a 3-ounce can of potted meat was protein that cost less than a dime and lasted weeks in the cupboard. You took 2 cups of dried egg noodles, 1 can of potted meat, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup, a half cup of milk, and a handful of frozen peas. Everything went into a greased baking dish raw, stirred together, covered tightly with foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 40 minutes. The noodles cooked in the soup and milk, the potted meat dissolved into the sauce, and the peas added a bit of color and sweetness. The result was bland by modern standards, but filling and warm, and it cost about 8 cents per serving. Seniors who made this weren't proud of it, but they ate it anyway, and that mattered more than pride. Ham spread rice bake used another forgotten pantry staple, deviled ham spread, the kind that came in tiny flat cans with a devil on the label. You took 1 cup of uncooked white rice, 1 small can of deviled ham, 1 can of cream of celery soup, a cup and a half of water, and a half cup of frozen peas. Everything dumped into a greased baking dish, stirred once, covered tightly with foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 50 minutes. The rice absorbed the soup and water. The deviled ham dissolved into the grains, and the peas added texture. The flavor was mild and slightly smoky and faintly spiced from whatever seasonings the ham spread contained. A senior could make this for about 12 cents per serving, and it reheated without drying out. This was the meal that proved you didn't need fresh meat to eat decently. You just needed ingenuity and a hot oven. These 15 suppers show how 1950s seniors turned canned meats, Spam, Vienna sausages, corned beef, potted meat, deviled ham, into hot meals that cost almost nothing. They didn't apologize for using cans. They opened, dumped, baked, and ate with quiet dignity. Canned chicken dumpling bake was the poor man's version of the comfort food classic made without rolling dough or simmering broth for hours. You took 1 12-ounce can of chicken with its broth, 1 can of cream of chicken soup, a cup of frozen mixed vegetables, and a cup of biscuit mix stirred with a half cup of milk into a thick batter. The chicken, soup, and vegetables went into a greased baking dish and stirred together. Then you dropped spoonfuls of the biscuit batter over the top, leaving gaps for steam to escape. Uncovered, it baked at 375 degrees for 35 minutes until the dumplings puffed up and turned golden. The result was tender chicken, soft vegetables, and fluffy dumplings soaking up the creamy sauce below. A senior could make this for about 22 cents per serving, and it tasted far better than the sum of its canned parts. This was the meal that said, "I still deserve comfort." Sweet potato luncheon bake paired canned luncheon meat with the natural sweetness of sweet potatoes, creating a dish that felt almost festive despite its humble origins. You took one 12-ounce can of treat or Spam sliced thick, two large sweet potatoes peeled and sliced into rounds, a quarter cup of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of butter cut into small pieces, and a half cup of water. You layered the sweet potato slices into a greased baking dish, arranged the meat slices on top, sprinkled brown sugar over everything, dotted with butter, poured the water around the edges, covered tightly with foil, and baked at 375 degrees for an hour. The sweet potatoes caramelized, the meat browned slightly, and the butter and sugar melted into a glaze. A senior could make this for about 19 cents per serving, and it was one of the few ways to make canned meat feel like a holiday meal. Cabbage and canned meat. Casserole was the dish that German and Eastern European grandmothers brought to America and adapted to whatever they could afford. You took half a small head of cabbage shredded, one 12-ounce can of Spam or corned beef chopped, 1 can of condensed tomato soup, a half cup of water, and a handful of caraway seeds if you had them. Everything layered into a greased baking dish. Cabbage on the bottom, meat scattered over, soup and water mixed and poured on top, caraway sprinkled across. Covered tightly with foil, it baked at 350 degrees for an hour until the cabbage softened and sweetened and the soup thickened into a tangy sauce. The result was hearty, slightly tangy, and filling in a way that stuck with you. A senior could make this for about 14 cents per serving, and it tasted better the second day when the flavors had fully melded. Little sausage macaroni bake used Vienna sausages, those tiny canned hot dogs that came packed in salty brine and cost almost nothing. You took 1 can of Vienna sausages drained and sliced, 2 cups of dried elbow macaroni, 1 can of condensed cheddar cheese soup, a cup and a half of milk, and a pinch of paprika. Everything except the paprika went into a greased baking dish raw, stirred together, covered tightly with foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 40 minutes. Then you uncovered it, sprinkled paprika over the top for color, and baked for 5 more minutes. The macaroni cooked in the cheese soup and milk, the sausages added little bursts of salty flavor, and the whole thing came together into something that tasted faintly like hot dogs and mac and cheese. A senior could make this for about 11 cents per serving, and kids who visited Grandma actually asked for it by name. Hash and egg breakfast casserole blurred the line between breakfast and dinner, which was common in households where a hot meal was a hot meal, no matter what time of day it appeared. You took 1 15-ounce can of corned beef hash, 4 eggs, a half cup of milk, a half cup of shredded cheddar cheese, and a pinch of salt and pepper. The hash went into a greased baking dish and spread into an even layer. You beat the eggs with the milk, poured them over the hash, sprinkled cheese on top, and baked it uncovered at 375 degrees for 30 minutes until the eggs set and the cheese melted into golden patches. The result was a dense, filling, protein-rich meal that cost about 18 cents per serving and could be eaten morning, noon, or night. Seniors who made this understood that the clock was a suggestion, not a rule. These 20 dump-and-bake suppers prove that 1950s seniors could turn canned meat, cheap starches, and whatever vegetables they had into complete meals for pennies. No fancy techniques, no wasted ingredients, just smart, practical cooking that kept them independent and well-fed. Pantry tuna noodle bake was the dish that every church cookbook in America included between 1950 and 1970, and for good reason. It required nothing fresh, nothing expensive, nothing that couldn't sit on a shelf for months waiting to be opened. You took 1 6-ounce can of tuna packed in water and drained, 2 cups of dried egg noodles, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup, a half cup of milk, a half cup of frozen peas, and a handful of crushed potato chips or breadcrumbs for the topping. Everything except the chips went into a greased baking dish raw, stirred together until the soup and milk coated the noodles evenly, covered tightly with aluminum foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 40 minutes without opening the oven door once. 5 minutes before it was done, you uncovered it, scattered the crushed chips across the top in an even layer, and returned it to the oven to crisp up and turn golden brown. The noodles cooked directly in the soup and tuna juices, absorbing every bit of flavor, while the peas added small bursts of sweetness and bright green color that made the dish look less monotonous. The result was creamy, filling, and surprisingly satisfying, considering it cost about 14 cents per serving in $1956. A senior living alone could eat from this casserole for 3 full days, reheating individual portions in a low oven without the noodles turning mushy or the sauce separating. The beauty of Pantry tuna noodle bake was not just its low cost or its simplicity. It was the fact that it tasted like someone cared enough to make a real meal, even when that someone was cooking only for themselves in a quiet kitchen. Salmon cake. Casserole took the idea of fried salmon patties and turned it into a one-dish meal that required no standing at the stove, no flipping delicate patties with a spatula, and no grease spattering across the stovetop and onto your clothes. You took 1 14-ounce can of salmon with the bones and skin included because that was where the calcium lived, 1 cup of crushed saltine crackers, 2 eggs beaten, a 1/4 cup of milk, 1 small onion diced fine, and a generous pinch of black pepper. You drained the salmon, dumped it into a mixing bowl, and used a fork to mash it thoroughly until the tiny bones broke down into fragments so small they disappeared completely into the mixture and added nutrition without texture. Then you stirred in the crackers, eggs, milk, onion, and pepper until everything held together in a thick, cohesive mass that was moist but not soupy. Instead of forming individual patties and frying them in batches, you pressed the entire mixture into a greased square or rectangular baking dish, smoothed the top with the back of a spoon, and baked it uncovered at 375 degrees for 35 minutes until the top turned golden brown and the edges crisped slightly and pulled away from the sides of the pan. The result was a firm, sliceable casserole that tasted exactly like salmon patties but required a fraction of the effort and none of the mess. A senior could cut this into neat squares, eat 1 portion hot from the oven with a squeeze of lemon juice if available, and refrigerate the rest for later meals that reheated beautifully in a low oven or even cold straight from the refrigerator for a quick lunch. Mackerel tomato rice was the supper that proved canned fish didn't always have to mean tuna, and in fact, our canned mackerel cost even less than tuna in most grocery stores during the 1950s, while providing just as much protein and even more of the fish oils that kept joints flexible and minds sharp. Its stronger flavor actually worked better in certain dishes where you needed the fish to stand up to bold ingredients like tomatoes, onions, and garlic without disappearing into the background. You took 1 15-ounce can of mackerel drained and broken into large chunks with your fingers, 1 cup of uncooked long-grain white rice, 1 can of diced tomatoes with all their juice included, 1 medium onion diced, 1 clove of garlic minced if you had it, or a pinch of garlic powder if you didn't, 1 bay leaf, and 1 cup of plain water. Everything went into a greased baking dish in whatever order felt natural, stirred together gently with a spoon so the fish didn't completely fall apart into tiny shreds, covered tightly with aluminum foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 50 minutes without peeking or stirring. The rice absorbed the tomato liquid and the oils from the fish, turning slightly pink and deeply flavorful, while the onion softened and sweetened, and the bay leaf added a faint herbal note that made the whole thing taste more deliberate and less like something thrown together from cans. A senior could make this for about 12 cents per serving, and the leftovers reheated without drying out or losing flavor. In fact, they often tasted even better the next day once everything had time to marry together overnight in the refrigerator. Sardine skillet supper was the dish that separated the truly frugal from the squeamish, because sardines were among the cheapest sources of protein available in American grocery stores during the 1950s, often costing less than a nickel per small flat can, but their strong fishy flavor and their soft edible bones made them deeply polarizing among people who hadn't grown up eating them regularly. Seniors who had been raised in coastal communities or immigrant households, however, knew exactly how to turn them into something filling, nourishing, and almost elegant despite their humble origins. You took 2 small cans of sardines packed in oil with the oil reserved and not drained away, 3 medium potatoes scrubbed clean and sliced as thin as you could manage with a sharp knife, 1 large yellow onion sliced into rings, 1 tablespoon of butter cut into small pieces, and a generous pinch of salt and black pepper. You layered the potato slices into the bottom of a greased cast-iron skillet or baking dish, arranged the drained sardines on top in a single layer, covered them completely with the onion rings, dotted everything with the small pieces of butter, drizzled the reserved sardine oil over the top for extra richness and flavor, seasoned it all with salt and pepper, covered the skillet tightly with aluminum foil, and baked it at 375 degrees for a full hour until the potatoes were fork tender and the sardines had partially melted into the dish and flavored everything around them. The result was a soft, savory, deeply flavored meal that cost about 10 cents per serving and provided an astonishing amount of calcium from the edible bones, omega-3 fatty acids from the fish oils, and protein from the sardines themselves. Chip-top tuna bake was the variation on classic tuna noodle casserole that added 1 simple ingredient, crushed potato chips, scattered across the top, and turned something plain and forgettable into something that people actually requested by name and asked for seconds of at church potlucks and family gatherings. You took 1 6-ounce can of tuna drained completely, 2 cups of egg noodles that had been boiled separately and drained, 1 can of cream of celery soup straight from the can, a half cup of whole milk, a half cup of frozen peas still frozen, and 1 full cup of potato chips crushed into coarse crumbs with your hands inside the bag. Unlike most dump and bake recipes on this list, this one required you to cook the noodles first on the stovetop, but beyond that single step, it was pure simplicity and zero fuss. You dumped the drained tuna, cooked noodles, soup, milk, and frozen peas into a greased baking dish, stirred everything together until the soup and milk coated all the noodles evenly, then spread the crushed potato chips in an even layer across the entire top without stirring them into the mixture. It baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 25 minutes until the chips turned golden brown and crunchy on top, while the casserole bubbled around the edges. The chips provided a salty, crunchy contrast to the creamy tuna mixture below, and that textural difference between crispy top and soft interior elevated the entire dish from plain to memorable. A senior could make this for about 16 cents per serving, and it was one of the few ways to make canned tuna feel like a treat rather than a compromise or a last resort when the budget ran out before the month did. These 25 dump-and-bake suppers prove that 1950s seniors turned canned fish, tuna, salmon, mackerel, sardines, into hot, filling meals for pennies. No fresh seafood needed, no complicated prep. Just open, dump, bake, and eat. Budget cooking that kept bodies nourished and spirits unbroken. Salmon and pea hot dish was a Midwestern staple that stretched one can of salmon across multiple satisfying servings by pairing it with frozen peas, cooked rice, and a creamy soup-based sauce that held everything together. You took one 14-ounce can of salmon, drained and flaked gently with a fork so the chunks stayed somewhat intact, 2 full cups of frozen peas straight from the freezer bag, 1 can of cream of celery soup, a half cup of whole milk, 1 cup of cooked white rice that could be leftover from yesterday or freshly made, and a generous handful of crushed saltine crackers for the topping. The salmon, peas, soup, milk, and rice all went into a greased square baking dish, stirred gently with a spoon, just enough to combine without turning the salmon into paste, topped with the crushed crackers spread evenly across the surface, and baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the casserole bubbled enthusiastically around the edges and the crackers turned golden brown. The celery soup added a mild, slightly herbal flavor that complemented the salmon beautifully without overwhelming its delicate taste, and the peas provided sweetness, bright color, and a slight textural pop. The rice stretched the expensive protein into more servings and made the dish more filling, while the cracker topping added a satisfying crunch that contrasted nicely with the creamy interior. A senior could make this entire casserole for about 19 cents per serving, and it tasted far more elegant and deliberate than its simple canned goods ingredient list would ever suggest to someone just reading the recipe on paper. Cornflake fish casserole was the dish that used America's favorite breakfast cereal as both a binder mixed into the casserole itself and as a crispy topping scattered across the surface, creating a finished dish that was simultaneously creamy and crunchy in every single bite. You took 1 6-ounce can of tuna drained thoroughly, 1 can of cream of chicken soup straight from the can without diluting it, a half cup of whole milk, a half cup of frozen peas, and 2 full cups of cornflakes divided exactly in half for 2 different purposes. Half the cornflakes went directly into the tuna mixture where they acted as a stretcher and binder, soaking up excess moisture and adding body and texture to what would otherwise be a thin, soupy mixture. The tuna, soup, milk, peas, and 1 cup of coarsely crushed cornflakes all went into a greased baking dish and stirred together thoroughly. Then you spread the remaining cup of crushed cornflakes across the top in an even layer, drizzled 1 tablespoon of melted butter over them so they would brown and crisp instead of staying pale and soft, and baked the whole thing uncovered at 350 degrees for 25 minutes until the top turned deep golden brown and crunchy while the casserole underneath bubbled and steamed. The result was a casserole that had 2 completely distinct textures: soft, creamy, and yielding inside, crisp, buttery, and crunchy on top. A senior could make this for about 13 cents per serving, and the cornflakes made it feel less like a desperate budget meal and more like a deliberate recipe that someone had actually planned and thought through. This was the casserole that kids and grandkids actually liked and ate without complaining, which meant grandmothers living alone could serve it when family visited without feeling embarrassed about serving something cheap. Tomato fish and rice bake was the meal you made when you wanted something that tasted faintly Mediterranean or vaguely Spanish but cost almost nothing and required 0 special ingredients beyond what sat on your pantry shelf already. You took 1 15-ounce can of mackerel or salmon, drained and broken into large bite-sized chunks with your fingers, 1 cup of uncooked long-grain white rice straight from the bag, 1 8-ounce can of tomato sauce, 1 medium yellow onion diced into small pieces, 1 clove of fresh garlic minced fine if you had it, or half a teaspoon of garlic powder if you didn't, 1 bay leaf, and 1½ cups of plain tap water. Everything went into a greased rectangular baking dish in whatever order felt natural to you, stirred together gently with a wooden spoon so the fish chunks didn't completely disintegrate into mush, covered tightly with aluminum foil crimped around the edges, and baked at 350 degrees for 55 minutes without opening the oven door even once to check on it. The rice absorbed all the tomato sauce and water as it cooked, the fish oils melted into the grains and flavored them from the inside out, and the onion and garlic added depth and complexity without overwhelming the other more delicate flavors. The result was a dish that tasted faintly Spanish or Italian, slightly tangy from the tomatoes, and deeply satisfying in the way that only rice cooked in flavorful liquid can be. The rice turned a lovely pale pink color from the tomatoes and looked almost festive on the plate. A senior could make this entire dish for about 14 cents per serving, and the leftovers reheated beautifully over the next 2 days without drying out or losing any flavor. In fact, they often tasted even better after sitting overnight when all the flavors had fully blended together. Sardine bread pudding was one of the most unusual and unexpected dishes on this entire list, and also one of the most practical and resourceful for seniors who found themselves with nothing in the kitchen except a few slices of stale bread going hard on the counter and a forgotten can of sardines sitting in the back of the cupboard. You took 4 thick slices of stale white bread torn by hand into rough chunks about an inch across, 2 small cans of sardines packed in oil with all the oil included and not drained away because that oil was flavor and richness, 2 eggs beaten thoroughly with a fork, 1 cup of whole milk, 1 small onion diced into tiny pieces, and a generous pinch of black pepper and dried thyme if you had it. The torn bread chunks went into the bottom of a greased baking dish and spread out evenly. The sardines were broken apart gently with your fingers and scattered over the bread, along with all their oil. The diced onion went on top of that, and then you beat the eggs thoroughly with the milk and seasonings and poured that eggy custard slowly over everything, pressing down gently with the back of a spoon to make sure all the bread pieces were fully submerged and soaking in the liquid. The bread soaked up the egg custard and the sardine oil, the onion added a bit of sharpness and texture, and the whole thing baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 40 minutes until the top turned golden brown and slightly crispy, while the interior set into a firm, sliceable texture. The result was a savory bread pudding that tasted like a cross between stuffing and a fish casserole, hearty and filling and surprisingly good. Cracker Top Tuna Supper was the simplest, most stripped-down version of tuna casserole imaginable, reduced to its absolute bare essentials and topped with nothing fancier than crushed saltine crackers and a bit of butter to help them brown. You took 1 6-ounce can of tuna, drained completely and flaked, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup straight from the can, a ½ cup of whole milk, a ½ cup of frozen peas, still frozen, and 1 cup of saltine crackers crushed coarsely and divided exactly in half. Half the crushed crackers went directly into the tuna mixture, where they stretched the protein, soaked up excess liquid, and added body and substance to what would otherwise be a thin, watery mixture. The tuna, soup, milk, peas, and half the crackers all went into a greased baking dish and stirred together with a fork until everything was evenly combined. Then you scattered the remaining ½ cup of crushed crackers across the top in an even layer, dotted them with 1 tablespoon of butter cut into 4 or 5 small pieces, and baked the whole thing uncovered at 350 degrees for 25 minutes until the cracker topping turned golden brown and crispy, while the casserole underneath bubbled gently around the edges. The result was simple, unpretentious, filling, and exactly what it claimed to be, with no surprises and no apologies. A senior could make this for about 12 cents per serving, and the leftovers reheated in a low oven without losing their texture or turning soggy the way some casseroles did. This was the meal that said plainly and honestly, I don't need fancy cooking or expensive ingredients or complicated techniques. I just need food that fills my stomach and keeps me going. And that was enough. Re-hook. These 30 suppers show how 1950s seniors turned 5 ingredients or less into complete meals for pennies. Canned fish, cheap starches, a can of soup, and crackers. That was all it took. No wasted motion, no wasted money, no apologies. Just practical cooking that kept people fed. Egg and noodle comfort bake was the classic meatless Monday meal that seniors living alone made when the grocery budget was stretched too thin to afford even cheap ground beef, and when payday was still several days away, and the cupboard held nothing but pantry staples that had been sitting there for weeks. You took 2 full cups of dried egg noodles straight from the bag, 4 whole eggs, 1 cup of small curd cottage cheese, a half cup of whole milk, 1 tablespoon of butter melted in a small saucepan, and a generous pinch of salt and freshly ground black pepper. The dried noodles went into a greased square baking dish, raw and uncooked. The eggs were beaten thoroughly in a mixing bowl with the cottage cheese, milk, melted butter, and all the seasonings until everything was smooth and well combined. Then that eggy custard mixture was poured slowly over the raw noodles, making sure to distribute it evenly across the entire pan. You stirred everything together with a fork so all the noodles were coated and submerged in the liquid, covered the dish tightly with aluminum foil, and baked it at 350 degrees for 40 minutes until the noodles were completely tender and the egg custard had set into a soft, creamy, almost pudding-like consistency. The cottage cheese added both protein and a pleasant creaminess without the expense of meat, and the eggs turned the whole thing into a substantial filling meal that stuck to your ribs. A senior could make this entire dish for about 10 cents per serving, and it tasted like genuine comfort food despite being one of the absolute cheapest dishes on this entire list. This was the meal that proved conclusively that you didn't need meat to eat well or to feel satisfied. You just needed eggs, dairy, a bit of starch, and a little ingenuity. Seniors who had grown up on farms or in rural communities made this dish regularly and without complaint, because eggs and milk were often far more accessible and affordable than any kind of meat. Cheesy rice supper was the dish that transformed plain, everyday white rice into something rich, filling, satisfying, and almost indulgent, using nothing more than cheese, butter, milk, and a pinch of salt, ingredients that almost every kitchen had on hand even when money was desperately tight. You took 1 cup of uncooked long-grain white rice, 2 full cups of whole milk instead of water for extra richness and creaminess, 1 heaping cup of shredded sharp cheddar cheese that you could shred yourself from a block to save money, 1 tablespoon of butter cut into small pieces, and a good pinch of salt. The rice, milk, butter, and salt all went together into a greased baking dish, stirred once with a spoon to distribute everything evenly, covered tightly with aluminum foil crimped securely around all the edges, and baked at 350 degrees for 50 full minutes without peeking or stirring until the rice had absorbed every drop of the milk and turned soft, tender, and creamy. 5 minutes before it was completely done, you uncovered the dish, stirred in the shredded cheese with a fork until it melted completely into the hot rice and created a smooth, velvety sauce, then returned it to the oven uncovered for just a few more minutes to let the very top brown slightly and form a delicate golden crust. The result was a dish that tasted remarkably like a cross between creamy risotto and baked macaroni and cheese, but required absolutely no stirring, no standing at the stove, and no stovetop cooking at all. A senior could make this for about 14 cents per serving, and it paired beautifully with any leftover cooked vegetables or a simple side of canned green beans or peas. This was the meal that proved starch and dairy together could be a complete, satisfying supper, all on their own, with no meat whatsoever required. It was filling, inexpensive, comforting in the way that only melted cheese can be, and simple enough that even someone with severe arthritis or limited hand strength could assemble it without difficulty. No-boil macaroni and cheese was the absolute revelation that changed how many seniors cooked pasta forever once they discovered this method. Because instead of boiling the noodles separately in a big pot of water on the stovetop and then draining them in a colander over the sink, you simply dumped everything raw into a baking dish and let the oven do absolutely all the work while you sat down and rested. You took 2 full cups of dried elbow macaroni straight from the box, 2½ cups of whole milk, 1½ cups of shredded sharp cheddar cheese, 1 tablespoon of butter cut into small pieces, and a good pinch of salt. Every single ingredient went into a greased baking dish completely raw, stirred together with a wooden spoon until the macaroni was evenly distributed and submerged in the milk, covered tightly with aluminum foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes, pausing halfway through to stir it once so the macaroni on top didn't dry out. The macaroni absorbed the milk slowly as it cooked. The cheese melted gradually into the hot liquid and created a creamy sauce, and the butter added just enough richness to make it taste homemade rather than cheap. The result was thick, creamy, satisfying, and exactly what you wanted from macaroni and cheese, with absolutely 0 pots to wash afterward. A senior could make this for about 11 cents per serving, and it was one of the most frequently requested dishes when grandchildren came to visit for the afternoon. This was the meal that proved convenience and homemade cooking were not opposites or enemies. They could exist together in the same dish. You didn't need boxed macaroni and cheese with powdered sauce packets when you could make the real thing this easily with actual cheese and actual milk for about the same price. Golden egg and potato bake was the classic breakfast for dinner dish that seniors made when they needed something hot, filling, cheap, and comforting, but had almost nothing in the kitchen except eggs and potatoes, 2 of the most reliable and affordable ingredients in any budget kitchen. You took 3 medium-sized potatoes peeled and sliced as thin as you could manage with a sharp knife, 4 whole eggs, a ½ cup of whole milk, a ½ cup of shredded cheddar cheese, 1 tablespoon of butter cut into tiny pieces, and a generous pinch of salt and freshly ground black pepper. The thin potato slices went into the bottom of a greased baking dish arranged in overlapping layers like shingles on a roof. The eggs were beaten thoroughly in a bowl with the milk, salt, and pepper, and then poured slowly and evenly over the layered potatoes, making sure every slice was coated. You dotted the top with the small pieces of butter scattered across the surface, covered the dish tightly with aluminum foil, and baked it at 375 degrees for 50 full minutes until the potatoes were completely fork tender and the eggs had set into a custard that held everything together. 5 minutes before it was done, you uncovered the dish, sprinkled the shredded cheese across the entire top, and let it melt into golden, bubbly patches under the oven's heat. The result was a dish that tasted like a perfect cross between scalloped potatoes and a frittata, filling and satisfying and cheap. A senior could make this for about 12 cents per serving, and it worked equally well for breakfast, lunch, or dinner without anyone questioning why eggs were appearing at supper time. This was the meal that proved eggs and potatoes were a match made in budget heaven, 2 ingredients that together could feed you well for almost nothing. Cottage noodle casserole was the Eastern European dish that Jewish and Polish and Hungarian grandmothers called kugel, and that everyone else in America simply called that sweet noodle thing with cottage cheese, without quite understanding what it was, or where it came from, or why it worked so well. You took 2 full cups of dried egg noodles, 1 cup of small curd cottage cheese, 2 eggs beaten, a quarter cup of sour cream for richness and tang, 1 tablespoon of butter melted, 1 tablespoon of granulated white sugar, and a good pinch of ground cinnamon. The dried noodles went into a greased baking dish, raw and uncooked. The cottage cheese, eggs, sour cream, melted butter, sugar, and cinnamon were all mixed together in a bowl until smooth and well combined, then poured over the raw noodles and stirred thoroughly so every noodle was coated in the creamy mixture. Covered tightly with aluminum foil, it baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until the noodles were completely tender and the custard had set into a firm, sliceable texture. The result was a dish that straddled the line between sweet and savory in a way that confused people who had never tasted it before, comforting and slightly unusual and utterly delicious. A senior could make this for about 13 cents per serving. And it tasted even better the next day when the flavors had fully melded together and the texture had firmed up even more. This was the meal that connected generations across decades because every Jewish or Polish or Hungarian grandmother made some version of it using the recipe she learned from her own mother, and every grandchild who grew up eating it remembered it for the rest of their lives. Rehook. These 35 suppers prove that 1950s seniors could make complete meals without meat. Eggs, cheese, cottage cheese, noodles, rice, potatoes, cheap, filling ingredients that turned into hot dinners for pennies. Meatless Monday wasn't a trend. It was survival dressed as supper. Southern cheese grits bake was the dish that turned a humble breakfast staple eaten across the American South into a hearty dinner casserole, and it worked beautifully because grits were cheap, filling, and absorbed flavor like nothing else. You took 1 cup of quick-cooking grits straight from the box, 4 cups of water, 1 cup of shredded sharp cheddar cheese, 2 whole eggs, 1 tablespoon of butter, and a generous pinch of salt and cayenne pepper for a bit of heat. The grits and water went into a medium saucepan on the stovetop and cooked over medium heat for about 5 minutes, stirring frequently until the mixture thickened into a smooth, creamy porridge. Then you removed it from the heat and stirred in the cheese, butter, salt, and cayenne until everything melted completely. Off the heat, you beat the 2 eggs in a small bowl, then stirred them quickly into the hot grits so they didn't scramble, but instead created a rich, custard-like texture. The entire mixture was poured into a greased baking dish, smoothed across the top, and baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 35 minutes until the surface turned golden brown and the grits set into a firm, sliceable texture that could be cut into neat squares. The result was creamy, cheesy, slightly spicy from the cayenne, and filling enough to be a complete meal all on its own. A senior could make this for about 9 cents per serving, making it one of the absolute cheapest hot dinners on this entire list, and it was so filling that one modest portion would keep you satisfied for hours. This was the meal that Southerners ate regularly without giving it a second thought, and Northerners tasted for the first time at church potlucks or visiting relatives and immediately asked for the recipe to take home. Bread and egg pudding supper was the savory version of bread pudding, specifically designed to turn stale bread that was going hard and dry into a hot, filling, nourishing meal rather than a sweet dessert. You took 4 thick slices of stale white bread torn by hand into rough chunks, 3 whole eggs, 1½ cups of whole milk, a ½ cup of shredded cheddar or American cheese, 1 small onion diced fine, and a generous pinch of salt, black pepper, and dried thyme or parsley if you had it. The torn bread chunks went into the bottom of a greased baking dish and spread out evenly, the diced onions scattered over them. The eggs beaten thoroughly in a bowl with the milk and all the seasonings, then poured slowly over the bread, making sure every piece was soaked through. You pressed everything down gently with the back of a spoon to make sure the bread was fully submerged and soaking in the eggy custard, sprinkled the shredded cheese evenly across the entire top, and baked it uncovered at 350 degrees for 40 minutes until the custard set completely and the top turned golden brown with crispy edges. The result was a dish that tasted remarkably like a cross between savory stuffing and a crustless quiche, filling and satisfying and warm. A senior could make this for about 10 cents per serving, and it turned bread that was literally one day away from being thrown in the trash into something that tasted deliberate and planned and actually good. This was the meal that proved waste was always a choice rather than a necessity, and that with a little creativity and a few eggs, nothing ever had to be thrown away, as long as you were willing to think beyond the obvious uses for ingredients. Cheese toast. Casserole was the dish that took the familiar idea of grilled cheese sandwiches and turned it into a baked casserole that required no flipping, no careful watching on the stovetop, and no standing in front of a hot stove pressing sandwiches down with a spatula. You took 6 slices of regular white sandwich bread, 1½ cups of shredded cheddar cheese, 2 eggs, 1½ cups of whole milk, 1 tablespoon of butter melted, and a good pinch of salt and dry mustard powder. Half the bread slices went into the bottom of a greased baking dish arranged in a single layer, half the cheese scattered evenly over them, the remaining bread slices layered on top of that, and the remaining cheese sprinkled across the very top. The eggs were beaten thoroughly in a bowl with the milk, melted butter, salt, and dry mustard, then poured slowly and evenly over all the bread layers, making sure every piece was soaked through. The whole thing sat at room temperature for 10 minutes, so the bread could fully absorb the liquid and soften, then baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 35 minutes until the top turned golden brown and the egg custard set completely. The result was a dish that tasted exactly like grilled cheese sandwiches but had a softer, a more custardy texture that was easier to chew and easier to digest for seniors with dental problems. A senior could make this for about 12 cents per serving, and it was one of the few ways to make plain bread and cheese feel like a proper, dignified meal rather than just a snack. This was the casserole that proved even the simplest ingredients could become something special with just a little bit of thought and technique. A senior could make this for about 12 cents per serving, and it was one of the few ways to make plain bread and cheese feel like a proper, dignified meal rather than just a snack. This was the casserole that proved even the simplest ingredients could become something special with just a little bit of thought and technique. Tomato cheese crumb bake was the dish that Italian grandmothers made when their cupboards held nothing but a can of tomatoes, a bit of cheese, and some stale bread going hard on the counter, and it tasted far better than that simple ingredient list would ever suggest. You took 1 14-ounce can of diced tomatoes drained of most, but not all of their juice, a 1 cup of shredded mozzarella or Italian blend cheese, 1 cup of stale bread torn into small pieces about the size of a walnut, 1 tablespoon of olive oil or melted butter, and a generous pinch of salt, dried oregano, and garlic powder. The drained tomatoes went into the bottom of a greased baking dish and spread out evenly, the shredded cheese scattered over them in an even layer, the torn bread pieces tossed in a bowl with the oil and all the seasonings until every piece was coated, then spread across the top of the cheese and tomatoes. It baked uncovered at 375 degrees for 25 minutes until the tomatoes bubbled enthusiastically around the edges, the cheese melted completely and got slightly browned in spots, and the bread pieces turned golden brown and crispy like croutons. The result was a dish that tasted remarkably like pizza without the crust, or like a deconstructed lasagna, tangy and cheesy and satisfying. A senior could make this for about 11 cents per serving, and it worked equally well as a side dish alongside some boiled pasta or as a light meal all on its own. This was the meal that proved Italian cooking was never about complexity or expense. It was about letting simple, good ingredients speak for themselves without interference. Spinach egg dump supper was the dish that turned a box of frozen spinach and a few eggs into something that tasted almost like a crustless quiche or a savory baked omelette. And it was one of the easiest ways for seniors to get a full serving of green vegetables without needing to buy, wash, chop, or cook fresh produce. You took one 10-ounce package of frozen chopped spinach thawed completely and squeezed absolutely dry in your hands to remove every drop of excess water, 4 whole eggs, 1 cup of small curd cottage cheese, a half cup of shredded cheddar cheese, a 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour to help everything bind together, and a generous pinch of salt and ground nutmeg. Every single ingredient went into a large mixing bowl and stirred together with a wooden spoon until thoroughly combined into a thick, green-flecked batter. Then the whole mixture was dumped into a greased baking dish, smoothed across the top with the back of a spoon, and baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 35 minutes until the eggs set completely and the top turned golden brown. The result was a firm, sliceable casserole that was absolutely packed with protein from the eggs and cottage cheese and vegetables from the spinach, making it one of the most nutritionally complete dishes on this entire list. A senior could make this for about 14 cents per serving, and it was one of the very few ways to get a full serving of greens without needing fresh produce that spoiled quickly or required lots of washing and chopping. This was the meal that proved frozen vegetables were not inferior to fresh. They were practical, affordable, shelf-stable for months, and just as nutritious. Seniors who made this dish understood instinctively that perfection was always the enemy of good enough. These 40 suppers show how 1950s seniors cooked without wasting a thing. Stale bread became casseroles, frozen spinach became dinner. Eggs and cheese stretched into meals. Every ingredient had a purpose. Every penny was accounted for. Nothing went to waste. That was the genius. Cornbread bean casserole was the ultimate Southern comfort food that combined 2 staples of poor Southern cooking, dried beans and cornbread, into a single baked dish that cost almost nothing and fed you for days. You took one 15-ounce can of pinto beans drained and rinsed, or you could use dried beans that you had soaked overnight and simmered until tender, 1 cup of yellow cornmeal, 1 egg beaten, 1 cup of buttermilk or regular milk with a tablespoon of vinegar stirred in to sour it, 1 tablespoon of bacon grease or vegetable oil, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and a good pinch of salt. The drained beans went into the bottom of a greased cast-iron skillet or square baking dish and spread out evenly across the entire surface. In a separate bowl, you stirred together the cornmeal, egg, buttermilk, bacon grease, baking powder, and salt until you had a thick, pourable batter that was smooth but not overmixed, because overmixing would make the cornbread tough. You poured that cornbread batter directly over the beans without stirring them together, spreading it gently with a spoon so it covered the beans completely like a blanket tucking them in. The whole thing baked uncovered at 400 degrees for 25 to 30 minutes until the cornbread topping puffed up beautifully and turned golden brown on top, and a toothpick inserted in the center came out clean. The result was a 2-layered dish with savory beans on the bottom and slightly sweet, crumbly cornbread on top, and when you cut into it with a serving spoon and scooped out a portion, you got both layers together in every single bite. A senior could make this entire dish for about 8 cents per serving, making it one of the absolute cheapest hot meals on this list. The beans provided protein and fiber that kept you full for hours. The cornbread provided filling carbohydrates and a pleasant texture contrast, and together they created a complete meal that needed nothing else alongside it except maybe a simple salad or some sliced raw onion if you had it. This was the meal that working-class Southern families ate multiple times a week without complaint, and seniors living alone continued making it because it required almost no effort, cost almost nothing, and tasted like home. Lima and tomato hot dish was the Midwestern answer to succotash, a simple vegetable casserole that stretched a can of lima beans across multiple servings by pairing them with canned tomatoes and a breadcrumb topping that added texture and visual interest to what would otherwise be a fairly plain dish. You took one 15-ounce can of lima beans, drained but not rinsed, so they kept a bit of their starchy cooking liquid for extra creaminess. One 14-ounce can of diced tomatoes with all their juice included because that juice was pure flavor. One small onion diced fine, 1 tablespoon of butter cut into small pieces, 1 tablespoon of granulated sugar to balance out the acidity of the tomatoes, and half a cup of dried breadcrumbs or crushed crackers mixed with a tablespoon of melted butter for the topping. The drained lima beans, tomatoes with their juice, diced onion, butter pieces, and sugar all went together into a greased baking dish and stirred gently to combine without mashing the beans. The buttered breadcrumbs scattered evenly across the entire top in a thin layer that would crisp up beautifully. The casserole baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 35 minutes until the tomatoes bubbled enthusiastically around the edges and the breadcrumb topping turned golden brown and crispy on top. The result was a vegetable dish that was substantial enough to serve as a meatless main course rather than just a side dish, with the tomatoes providing acidity and brightness that cut through the creamy richness of the lima beans, and the breadcrumb topping giving it a satisfying crunch that made every bite interesting. A senior could make this for about 9 cents per serving, and it was one of the few completely meatless dishes that actually felt filling and satisfying, rather than leaving you hungry an hour later, wondering when the next meal would come. The combination of beans and tomatoes was classic Depression-era cooking, stretching cheap vegetables into something that tasted deliberate and planned rather than thrown together from whatever was in the cupboard. Some people added a pinch of dried basil or oregano to make it taste more Italian, while others kept it plain and simple and let the natural flavors speak for themselves. Navy bean oven supper was the slow-baked bean dish that required almost no attention once you put it in the oven, making it absolutely perfect for seniors who wanted a hot meal waiting for them without having to stand at the stove, stirring and watching and worrying about things burning. You took 1 pound of dried navy beans that had been soaked in cold water overnight and then drained thoroughly, 1 small onion diced, 1 tablespoon of dark molasses or dark brown sugar for sweetness, 1 tablespoon of prepared yellow mustard for tang, 1 teaspoon of salt, half a teaspoon of black pepper, and enough plain water to cover everything by about 2 inches. If you happened to have a small piece of salt pork or a leftover ham hock sitting in the refrigerator, you could add it for extra flavor and richness. But the dish worked perfectly well without any meat at all and stayed completely vegetarian if that was important to you. Everything went into a deep baking dish or a traditional bean pot if you owned one, stirred together once with a wooden spoon, covered tightly with a lid or aluminum foil crimped securely around the edges, and baked at 300 degrees for 3 to 4 full hours until the beans were completely tender and creamy and almost melting, and the liquid had reduced down into a thick, flavorful sauce that coated every bean. You had to check on it once or twice during the long baking time to make sure the beans weren't drying out and sticking to the bottom of the dish, adding a bit more water whenever the level got too low. The result was a pot of beans that were soft, sweet, slightly tangy from the mustard, and deeply satisfying in that stick-to-your-ribs way that only slow-cooked beans can achieve. A senior could make this for about 6 cents per serving, and one batch would provide enough meals for nearly a week if stored properly in the refrigerator and reheated in small portions as needed throughout the days that followed. The beans actually tasted better on the second and third day, after all the flavors had time to meld together and deepen overnight in the cold. Red bean rice bake was the Louisiana-inspired dish that brought the flavors of New Orleans Creole cooking to budget kitchens across America. On using canned kidney beans and rice to create something that tasted almost like the famous red beans and rice served in fancy restaurants but cost a tiny fraction of the price and required no special cooking skills whatsoever. You took one 15-ounce can of red kidney beans, drained but not rinsed, so they kept some of their starchy liquid, 1 cup of uncooked long-grain white rice, 1 small onion diced, 1 stalk of celery diced if you happen to have it, 1 clove of garlic minced or half a teaspoon of garlic powder if you didn't have fresh, 1 bay leaf, half a teaspoon of dried thyme, a generous pinch of cayenne pepper for heat, and 2 cups of water or chicken broth if you had some saved. Everything went into a greased baking dish in whatever order felt natural to you. Stirred together thoroughly so the seasonings were evenly distributed, covered tightly with aluminum foil, and baked at 350 degrees for 55 minutes until the rice had absorbed all the liquid and turned tender, and the beans had softened and started to break down slightly, and thickened the mixture into something cohesive. The result was a dish that was filling, flavorful, slightly spicy from the cayenne, and satisfying in a way that plain rice and beans never could be on their own when served separately. The seasonings, the thyme, the bay leaf, the garlic, the cayenne transformed the humble ingredients into something that tasted like it came from a restaurant kitchen rather than a budget pantry stocked with cheap staples. A senior could make this for about 10 cents per serving, and it provided complete protein when the beans and rice were eaten together in the same meal, something that nutritionists would later confirm was important for people who couldn't afford meat regularly or at all. This was the meal that proved regional cooking traditions could survive and thrive even in poverty, as long as people remembered the recipes their mothers and grandmothers taught them and passed those recipes down to the next generation who would need them someday. Wiener and bean casserole was the kid-friendly dish that adults also secretly loved, combining hot dogs and baked beans into a sweet, savory casserole that cost almost nothing and pleased everyone at the table from the youngest grandchild to the oldest grandmother. You took one 15-ounce can of pork and beans in tomato sauce or plain baked beans, depending on what was on sale, 4 hot dogs sliced into thick rounds about half an inch thick, 1 small onion diced fine, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar packed, 1 tablespoon of prepared yellow mustard, and 1 tablespoon of ketchup. The beans went into a greased baking dish straight from the can, the sliced hot dogs stirred in along with the diced onion, and then you mixed together the brown sugar, mustard, and ketchup in a small bowl until smooth and stirred that sweet tangy sauce into the bean mixture until everything was evenly coated and glistening. And the whole thing baked uncovered at 375 degrees for 30 minutes until the beans bubbled enthusiastically around the edges and the hot dogs started to brown slightly and curl at the cut edges, and the sauce thickened into a sticky glaze that coated everything. The result was a dish that tasted like a cross between baked beans and barbecue, sweet and tangy and satisfying and familiar. A senior could make this for about 15 cents per serving, which was still extremely cheap, considering it included actual meat in the form of hot dogs. The hot dogs added protein and a bit of smokiness that elevated the beans, while the beans provided fiber and substance that stretched the expensive meat across multiple servings. This was the meal that grandmothers made when grandchildren came to visit for the afternoon, and because kids universally loved hot dogs and would eat them without complaining, even when they were mixed with beans. It was also the meal that appeared at every single church, potluck, and community supper throughout the 1950s, always carried in a large baking dish covered with aluminum foil, and it was always scraped completely clean by the end of the night, with nothing left to take home. These 45 suppers prove that 1950s seniors turned dried beans, canned beans, and cheap starches into complete meals for pennies. Beans provided protein when meat was unaffordable. Rice and cornbread stretched everything further. Every dish was filling, practical, and designed to waste nothing. Black eye and bacon bake was the Southern New Year's tradition turned into an everyday budget meal. Because black-eyed peas were cheap, filling, readily available in cans or dried form, and according to deeply held Southern superstition, brought good luck and prosperity when eaten on January 1st. You took one 15-ounce can of black-eyed peas drained and rinsed, or you could use dried peas that had been soaked in water overnight and then simmered on the stovetop until tender, 3 or 4 slices of regular bacon cut into small pieces with kitchen scissors, 1 small onion diced, 1 14-ounce can of diced tomatoes with all their juice included, a pinch of salt and black pepper, and a bay leaf if you happen to have one sitting in your spice cabinet. The bacon pieces went into a cold skillet and cooked over medium heat until they rendered their fat and started to crisp up and turn golden brown at the edges. Then you added the diced onion and cooked it in the bacon grease for about 3 minutes until it softened and turned translucent and started to smell sweet. The drained black-eyed peas, the bacon and onion mixture with every drop of the precious bacon grease included because that was flavor and richness, the can of tomatoes with their juice, the seasonings, and the bay leaf all went into a greased baking dish and stirred together thoroughly. It baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 40 minutes until the liquid reduced slightly and thickened, and the flavors melded together into something cohesive and delicious. The result was a dish that was smoky from the bacon, slightly tangy from the tomatoes, and deeply satisfying in the way that only beans cooked with a bit of pork fat can ever truly be. Or a senior could make this for about 12 cents per serving, and it provided both protein from the peas and incredible flavor from. The dish was filling enough to be a complete meal all on its own, though many Southern cooks served it over white rice to stretch it even further and make it feed more people. Black-eyed peas had a slightly earthy flavor and a creamy texture that was subtly different from other beans, and they paired beautifully with smoky bacon and acidic tomatoes. Split pea carrot casserole was the budget meal that turned 2 of the cheapest ingredients available in any grocery store into a thick, hearty, nourishing dish that could feed a senior living alone for multiple days without requiring any fresh ingredients or complicated preparation techniques. You took 1 cup of dried split peas that had been rinsed under cold water, but did not need to be soaked overnight because split peas cooked much faster than whole beans. 2 medium carrots peeled and diced into small uniform pieces, 1 small onion diced fine, 1 bay leaf for aromatic depth, 3 cups of water or chicken broth if you happen to have some left over from another meal, a ham bone or ham hock if you had saved one from a previous Sunday dinner, and a generous pinch of salt and black pepper to taste. Everything went into a deep baking dish or a small Dutch oven with a tight-fitting lid, stirred together once with a wooden spoon, Then covered tightly with the lid or aluminum foil crimped securely around all the edges, and baked at 325 degrees for 2 full hours without opening the oven door until the split peas had completely broken down into a thick, creamy puree, and the carrots were meltingly soft and sweet. You had to check on it once or twice during the long baking time to make sure it wasn't drying out and sticking to the bottom of the dish, adding a splash more water whenever the level got too low. The result was a dish that had the consistency of thick porridge or a very chunky soup, with the split peas providing plant-based protein and incredible creaminess without needing any dairy products, the carrots adding natural sweetness and bright orange color that made the dish look more appealing, and the ham bone or bacon providing a smoky depth that elevated the entire thing from plain to memorable. A senior could make this for about 7 cents per serving if using just the split peas and carrots without any meat at all, making it one of the absolute cheapest hot meals that was still nutritionally complete and genuinely filling. The dish was so thick and substantial that a small portion would keep you satisfied for many hours, and it was gentle on sensitive stomachs while still being packed with fiber and nutrients. White bean molasses bake was the classic New England-style baked bean dish that used dark molasses and prepared mustard to create a sweet, tangy sauce that turned plain white beans into something special enough to serve to company or bring to a church supper. You took 1 pound of dried Great Northern beans or navy beans that had been soaked in cold water overnight and then drained thoroughly in a colander, 1 small onion diced, 3 tablespoons of dark molasses, which had a deeper, more complex flavor than light molasses, 2 tablespoons of prepared yellow mustard, 1 tablespoon of brown sugar packed, 1 teaspoon of salt, half a teaspoon of black pepper, and enough plain water to cover the beans by about an inch above their surface. If you happen to have a small piece of salt pork or a few strips of bacon sitting in the refrigerator, you could nestle them down into the beans for extra flavor and richness. The dish worked perfectly well without any meat at all and stayed completely vegetarian if that mattered to you or your doctor. Everything went into a deep bean pot or a regular baking dish with high sides, stirred together thoroughly so the molasses and mustard were evenly distributed, covered tightly with a lid or aluminum foil, and baked at 300 degrees for 3 to 4 hours until the beans were completely tender and almost melting, and the liquid had reduced down into a thick, glossy, slightly syrupy sauce that coated every single bean beautifully. You had to check on it periodically during the long baking time to make sure the beans weren't drying out and scorching on the bottom, adding more water in small amounts whenever the level dropped too low. The result was a pot of beans that were sweet from the molasses and brown sugar, tangy and slightly sharp from the mustard, and deeply satisfying in that heavy, stick to your ribs way that only slow-cooked beans can achieve after hours in the oven. A senior could make this for about 6 cents per serving, and one batch would provide at least 6 or 7 meals if stored properly in a covered container in the refrigerator and reheated in small portions as needed throughout the week. The beans actually tasted better on the second and third day after resting. Lentil rice supper was the Middle Eastern-inspired dish that combined 2 of the world's oldest and most reliable staple foods into a simple, nutritious, complete meal that cost almost nothing and required minimal effort or cooking skill to prepare successfully. You took 1 cup of dried brown or green lentils rinsed thoroughly under cold running water to remove any dust or debris, 1 cup of uncooked long-grain white rice, in 1 medium onion diced, 1 clove of garlic minced, or half a teaspoon of garlic powder if you didn't have fresh garlic, 3 cups of water or vegetable broth if you had some, 1 tablespoon of olive oil or butter, and a generous pinch of salt, black pepper, and ground cumin if you happen to have it in your spice cabinet. Everything went into a greased baking dish, in whatever order felt natural to you, stirred together once with a spoon to distribute the seasonings evenly, covered tightly with aluminum foil, crimped securely around the edges, and baked at 350 degrees for 55 to 60 minutes until both the lentils and the rice were completely tender and had absorbed all the liquid, creating a dish that was cohesive and flavorful rather than soupy or watery. The result was a simple, honest, filling meal that tasted faintly exotic thanks to the cumin, but required nothing more than pantry staples that could sit on a shelf for months and a hot oven to bring them to life. The lentils and rice together provided complete protein with all the essential amino acids your body needed, meaning this dish could serve as a nutritionally adequate full meal without requiring any meat or dairy products to make it complete. A senior could make this for about 8 cents per serving, and it was one of the very few vegetarian dishes that actually felt substantial and satisfying rather than leaving you hungry an hour later, wondering when the next meal would arrive. The leftovers reheated beautifully without drying out and could even be eaten cold the next day, mixed with a bit of vinegar and olive oil to turn it into a simple grain salad. Lentils were faster cooking than other dried legumes and didn't require overnight soaking, making them ideal for seniors who wanted the nutrition and economy of beans without needing to plan a full day ahead. Butterbean and corn casserole was the classic southern vegetable combination that created a dish colorful enough to look interesting and appealing on the plate and filling enough to serve as a main course rather than just a side dish alongside meat. You took one 15-ounce can of butterbeans, which are also called Lima beans in some parts of the country, drained and rinsed. One 15-ounce can of whole kernel corn drained thoroughly, one small onion diced fine, one can of cream of celery soup straight from the can without diluting it, half a cup of whole milk, 1 tablespoon of butter cut into small pieces, and half a cup of crushed buttery crackers like Ritz, mixed with a tablespoon of melted butter for the topping. The drained butter beans, drained corn, diced onion, cream of celery soup, and milk all went into a greased baking dish and stirred together with a wooden spoon until the soup and milk coated everything evenly and there were no dry spots remaining. The butter pieces dotted across the top here and there, then the buttered cracker crumbs scattered evenly over the entire surface in a thin layer that would crisp up beautifully. Baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the casserole bubbled enthusiastically around the edges and the cracker topping turned golden brown and crispy on top. The result was a dish that was creamy, slightly sweet from the corn, and had a pleasant textural contrast between the soft-cooked vegetables below and the crunchy cracker topping above. A senior could make this for about 11 cents per serving, and it was substantial enough to be a complete meal when served with a slice of cornbread or a biscuit on the side to soak up the creamy sauce. Either way, it was a dish that proved 2 vegetables cooked together could be more filling and more interesting than either one served alone on its own plain plate. Every type of bean, every cooking method, every flavor combination that stretched protein across multiple meals for pennies. This was Depression-era wisdom carried forward into peacetime. Creamy potato scallop was the classic comfort food that turned plain, everyday potatoes into something rich, satisfying, and almost indulgent, using nothing more than milk, butter, flour, and a bit of patience while the oven worked its magic. You took 4 medium-sized potatoes, peeled and sliced as thin as you could possibly manage, with a sharp knife, because thinner slices cooked more evenly and absorbed more sauce. 2 tablespoons of butter, 2 tablespoons of all-purpose flour, 2 cups of whole milk, and a generous pinch of salt and white pepper if you had it, or black pepper if you didn't because white pepper was less visible in the finished dish. You made a simple white sauce by melting the butter in a small saucepan on the stovetop over medium heat, stirring in the flour with a wooden spoon to make a thick paste called a roux, then gradually whisking in the milk in a slow stream until you had a smooth, creamy sauce that was thick enough to coat the back of a spoon without being gluey. You arranged half the sliced potatoes in overlapping layers in a greased baking dish like shingles on a roof, poured half the white sauce over them, making sure to cover every slice, then repeated with the remaining potatoes and sauce in a second layer. The dish covered tightly with aluminum foil and baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes. Then you removed the foil and baked for another 15 minutes uncovered until the top turned golden brown and bubbly, and the potatoes were completely fork tender when you poked them with a knife. The result was a dish where the potatoes were soft and creamy and had absorbed the milk sauce. The sauce itself had thickened and concentrated into something rich and velvety, and the top had formed a delicate golden crust that added textural interest and visual appeal. Buttered cabbage noodle bake was the Eastern European peasant dish that Jewish, Polish, Hungarian, and Russian grandmothers brought with them to America and adapted to whatever ingredients they could find in American grocery stores, creating something that tasted like the old country despite being made with entirely different products. You took half a small head of green cabbage shredded as fine as you could manage with a sharp knife or a box grater, 2 cups of dried egg noodles, 3 tablespoons of butter divided, 1 small onion diced fine, and a generous pinch of salt, black pepper, and caraway seeds if you happened to have them in your spice cabinet, because caraway was traditional in Eastern European cooking. You melted 2 tablespoons of the butter in a large skillet on the stovetop over medium heat, added the diced onion and shredded cabbage together, and cooked them for about 10 minutes, stirring occasionally, until the cabbage wilted down dramatically and softened and started to turn slightly golden and caramelized at the edges where it touched the hot pan. Meanwhile, you boiled the egg noodles separately in a pot of salted water, according to the package directions, until just tender but not mushy, drained them thoroughly in a colander, and tossed them immediately with the remaining tablespoon of butter so they wouldn't stick together. The cooked cabbage and onion mixture, buttered noodles, caraway seeds if using, and salt and pepper all went into a greased baking dish and stirred together thoroughly so everything was evenly distributed. It baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 25 minutes until the top noodles turned slightly crispy and golden brown, and the whole dish was heated through completely and smelled absolutely incredible. The cabbage provided vitamins and fiber that kept you healthy, the noodles provided filling carbohydrates that gave you energy, and the butter added just enough richness to make it feel like real food. Sweet corn custard casserole was the unusual dish that turned canned corn into something that tasted almost like a dessert, walking that strange American line between sweet and savory that confused and delighted people in equal measure. You took 1 15-ounce can of whole kernel corn, drained thoroughly, 1 15-ounce can of creamed corn with all its thick, sweet liquid included, because that was essential for the custard texture, 2 eggs beaten thoroughly with a fork until completely smooth, a 1/4 cup of whole milk, 2 tablespoons of butter melted, 2 tablespoons of granulated white sugar, 2 tablespoons of all-purpose flour to help bind everything together, and a pinch of salt. The top turned golden brown and slightly puffed up like a soufflé before settling back down as it cooled. The result was a dish that was sweet, creamy, slightly custardy in texture, and tasted intensely and purely of corn in a way that was almost overwhelming at first, but became addictive after a few bites. Carrot and brown sugar rice was the unexpectedly sweet side dish that turned leftover rice and a couple of ordinary carrots into something that tasted almost like a dessert, but was served as part of the main meal. Another example of American home cooking's comfortable and unapologetic relationship with sweetness appearing in savory contexts. You took 2 medium carrots, peeled and grated fine on a box grater, until you had about a cup of fluffy shredded carrot. 1½ cups of cooked white rice that could be left over from yesterday's dinner or freshly made if you happened to be making rice anyway. 2 tablespoons of butter, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar packed firmly, a 1/4 cup of whole milk, and a pinch of salt and ground cinnamon. The butter melted in a medium skillet on the stovetop over medium heat. The grated carrots added and cooked for about 3 minutes while stirring occasionally until they softened slightly and released some of their moisture. Then the cooked rice, brown sugar, milk, salt, and cinnamon stirred in, and everything heated through together for another 2 minutes. The whole mixture went into a greased baking dish, smoothed across the top with a spoon, and baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 20 minutes until the top dried out slightly and the sugar caramelized at the edges and corners. The result was a dish that was sweet, slightly sticky, brightly colored from the orange carrots, and filling in the way that rice always is when cooked properly. A senior could make this for about 8 cents per serving. And it was a genuinely clever way to use up leftover rice that was starting to go stale and dry in the refrigerator and carrots that were getting a bit soft and bendy in the vegetable drawer. The carrots added vitamins and natural sweetness that complemented the added brown sugar, while the butter and milk made the whole thing taste rich and indulgent, despite being made from leftovers and pantry staples. This was the kind of recipe that appeared in community cookbooks under names like sweet carrot pilaf, or glazed carrot rice, or company rice. But most people just called it that sweet rice thing with the carrots, and ate it without questioning why rice needed to be sweet in the first place. Tomato bread. Comfort Bake was the Italian-American dish that turned stale bread and a single can of tomatoes into something that tasted almost like a deconstructed pizza or a bread-based lasagna, warm and comforting and filling in all the right ways. You took 4 thick slices of stale white bread or Italian bread torn by hand into rough chunks about 2 inches across, 1 14-ounce can of diced tomatoes with all their juice included, because that juice was essential for soaking the bread, 1 small onion diced fine, 1 clove of fresh garlic minced fine, or half a teaspoon of garlic powder. If you didn't have fresh, 2 tablespoons of olive oil or melted butter, 1 tablespoon of granulated sugar to balance the natural acidity of the tomatoes, and a generous pinch of salt, dried basil, and dried oregano. The torn bread chunks went into the bottom of a greased baking dish and spread out evenly in a single layer if possible. The canned tomatoes, with all their juice, diced onion, garlic, sugar, salt, and dried herbs all mixed together in a bowl with a spoon until well combined, then poured slowly over the bread chunks, making sure every single piece got thoroughly soaked. You drizzled the olive oil over the entire top, pressed everything down gently with the back of a spoon so the bread was fully submerged in the tomato mixture, and let it sit at room temperature for 5 minutes so the bread could absorb all that flavorful liquid. It baked uncovered at 375 degrees for 30 minutes until the tomatoes bubbled enthusiastically around the edges and the bread pieces on top turned golden brown and slightly crispy, while the bread underneath stayed soft and custardy. The result was a dish that tasted remarkably like pizza bread or Italian bread salad called panzanella, tangy from the tomatoes, fragrant from the herbs, and satisfying in a way that only bread soaked in flavorful liquid can truly be. These 55 suppers show how 1950s seniors turned vegetables and starches into complete meals. Potatoes, cabbage, corn, carrots, tomatoes, cheap produce that stretched into dinners. Every dish used what was available. Every penny was accounted for. Nothing went to waste. Squash cracker casserole was the southern summer dish that turned abundant garden-fresh yellow squash or zucchini into a creamy, cheesy, satisfying casserole that even people who claimed loudly to dislike squash would eat willingly and sometimes even ask for seconds. You took 3 medium yellow squash or zucchini sliced into thin rounds, about a 1/4 inch thick, 1 small onion diced fine, 1 can of cream of chicken soup straight from the can, half a cup of sour cream for richness and tang, 1 cup of shredded sharp cheddar cheese divided in half, and 1 cup of crushed buttery crackers like Ritz mixed with 2 tablespoons of melted butter for the crunchy topping. The sliced squash and diced onion went into a large pot with about 1 inch of water on the bottom and simmered on the stovetop for about 8 minutes until the squash was just barely tender but not mushy, then drained thoroughly in a colander because excess water would make the casserole soupy. The cooked and drained squash and onion went into a greased baking dish, the cream of chicken soup and sour cream stirred together in a bowl until smooth, then half the shredded cheese mixed in, and that creamy mixture poured over the squash and stirred gently to coat everything. The remaining half cup of cheese sprinkled evenly across the top, and finally the buttered cracker crumbs scattered over everything in a generous layer. It baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the casserole bubbled enthusiastically around the edges and the cracker topping turned deep golden brown and crispy. The result was a dish that was creamy, cheesy, crunchy on top, and far more delicious than anyone ever expected squash to be capable of tasting. A senior could make this for about 14 cents per serving when using homegrown squash from a backyard garden or a neighbor's overproducing plants, making it nearly free except for the cost of the soup, sour cream, cheese, and crackers. Yellow squash and zucchini were notoriously prolific garden vegetables that produced far more fruit than any single family could possibly eat. So gardeners were always desperately looking for new and interesting ways to use them up before they turned into baseball bats on the vine. Mashed turnip and potato bake was the humble root vegetable dish that combined 2 of the cheapest and longest-storing winter vegetables into something that was filling, nutritious, surprisingly tasty, and more interesting than either vegetable would be when served on its own. You took 2 medium potatoes, peeled and cut into rough chunks, 2 medium turnips peeled and cut into chunks of approximately the same size so they would cook evenly, 2 tablespoons of butter, a 1/4 cup of whole milk, half a cup of shredded sharp cheddar cheese, and a generous pinch of salt and black pepper to taste. 2 medium turnips peeled and cut into chunks of approximately the same size so they would cook evenly, 2 tablespoons of butter, a 1/4 cup of whole milk, half a cup of shredded sharp cheddar cheese, and a generous pinch of salt and black pepper to taste. The potato and turnip chunks went together into a medium pot with enough cold water to cover them by about 1 inch, brought to a boil over high heat, then reduced to a simmer and cooked for about 15 to 20 minutes. Until both vegetables were completely fork-tender and falling apart. You drained them thoroughly in a colander, returned them to the hot, empty pot, and mashed them together vigorously with a potato masher or a fork until mostly smooth but still retaining a bit of texture and character. You stirred in the butter and milk until everything was creamy and well combined, mixed in half the shredded cheese, and seasoned generously with salt and pepper, because root vegetables need quite a bit of seasoning to bring out their best flavors. The mashed mixture went into a greased baking dish, smoothed across the top with the back of a spoon, sprinkled with the remaining half cup of cheese, spread evenly across the entire surface, and baked uncovered at 375 degrees for 25 minutes until the cheese melted completely and got slightly browned and bubbly and crispy at the edges. The result was a dish that tasted remarkably like mashed potatoes, but had a slightly sharper, more complex, more interesting flavor from the turnips, and the melted cheese on top added a richness that made it feel less like poverty food and more like something you would deliberately choose to make. A senior could make this for about 9 cents per serving, and it was one of the very few ways to make turnips genuinely palatable and even delicious. Cauliflower cheese crumb bake was the dish that turned a bag of frozen cauliflower into something creamy, cheesy, rich, and satisfying enough to serve as a main course rather than just a forgettable side dish, proving conclusively that vegetables could be the star of the meal if you cooked them with care and the right combination of ingredients. You took one 16-ounce bag of frozen cauliflower florets straight from the freezer, 1 can of condensed cheddar cheese soup, a 1/4 cup of whole milk, 1/2 cup of shredded sharp cheddar cheese for extra cheese flavor, and 1/2 cup of dried breadcrumbs or crushed crackers mixed with 1 tablespoon of melted butter for the crunchy topping that would provide textural contrast. The frozen cauliflower went directly into a greased baking dish without thawing first, because frozen vegetables could go straight into the oven and cook perfectly. The cheese soup and milk whisked together in a bowl until completely smooth with no lumps remaining. Then that creamy cheese sauce poured over the frozen cauliflower and stirred gently with a spoon so the sauce coated all the florets even. The shredded cheese sprinkled over the top, and finally the buttered breadcrumbs scattered across the entire surface in a generous layer. It baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 40 minutes until the cauliflower was completely tender when pierced with a fork. The cheese sauce was bubbling enthusiastically around the edges, and the breadcrumb topping had turned deep golden brown and wonderfully crispy. The result was a dish that was rich, intensely cheesy, and filling in a way that made you forget you were eating a vegetable at all. A senior could make this for about 12 cents per serving, and frozen cauliflower was available year-round in every grocery store and required absolutely zero prep work, making it ideal for someone with limited hand strength, arthritis, or mobility issue. Cauliflower was one of the most nutritious vegetables available. Green bean mushroom bake was the casserole that became so completely iconic in American cooking that it appeared at nearly every single holiday table and church potluck from the 1950s onward for decades. And yet most people never once thought of it as budget food, even though it cost almost nothing to make from start to finish. You took 2 14-ounce cans of cut green beans drained thoroughly in a colander to remove excess liquid, 1 can of condensed cream of mushroom soup straight from the can without adding any water or milk, 1/2 cup of whole milk to thin the soup slightly, a good pinch of black pepper, and 1 cup of canned French fried onions divided exactly in half for 2 different uses. The drained green beans went into a greased baking dish. The cream of mushroom soup and milk whisked together in a bowl until smooth. Then that creamy sauce poured over the beans, the black pepper sprinkled across, half the fried onions stirred in and mixed throughout the casserole, and everything combined thoroughly with a spoon. It baked covered with aluminum foil at 350 degrees for 25 minutes to heat everything through. Then you uncovered it, scattered the remaining 1/2 cup of fried onions across the entire top in an even layer, and baked for another 5 minutes uncovered until the onions were heated through and slightly crisp. The result was a dish that was creamy, savory, familiar, and crunchy on top, comfortable in a way that made people feel safe and nostalgic. A senior could make this for about 13 cents per serving, using canned green beans that were available every single day of the year and required zero preparation beyond opening the can with a can opener. The cream of mushroom soup was the absolute magic ingredient that made thousands upon thousands of casseroles possible during the mid-20th century, turning plain vegetables into something that tasted rich and creamy and special without requiring expensive fresh mushrooms or complicated homemade cream sauce that took half an hour of stirring. Creamed corn cracker supper was the simple, humble, almost ridiculously easy dish that turned a single can of creamed corn into something that resembled a savory corn pudding or a corn custard, substantial enough to serve as a light meal rather than just a side dish when paired with a slice of bread. You took one 15-ounce can of creamed corn with all its thick, sweet liquid included, because that liquid was essential for the texture. 2 eggs, beaten thoroughly with a fork until completely smooth, half a cup of whole milk, half a cup of crushed saltine crackers to provide structure and absorb moisture, 1 tablespoon of butter melted, and a good pinch of salt and black pepper to balance the natural sweetness of the corn. Everything went into a mixing bowl and stirred together with a wooden spoon until completely combined into a thick, golden, slightly lumpy batter, and then poured into a greased square baking dish and smoothed across the top with the back of a spoon. It baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 35 to 40 minutes until the edges pulled away slightly from the sides of the dish. The top turned golden brown, and a butter knife inserted directly into the center came out clean, without any wet custard clinging to the blade, indicating that the eggs had fully set. The result was a dish that was soft, slightly sweet, custardy in texture, and tasted intensely and purely of corn in the most concentrated way possible. A senior could make this for about 9 cents per serving, and it was filling enough to be a complete meal when served with a slice of buttered bread or a biscuit on the side. The eggs added protein and helped everything hold together, and the crackers added body and prevented the mixture from being too wet, and the creamed corn provided both flavor and substance in equal measure. This was the ultimate pantry meal, requiring absolutely nothing fresh. These 60 dump and bake suppers prove that 1950s seniors were not just cooks, they were survivors who turned pennies into hot meals and empty cupboards into full bellies. Every casserole on this list cost less than a restaurant coffee costs today. Every recipe required nothing more than a baking dish, an oven, and the willingness to open a few cans or slice a few potatoes. No fancy equipment, no expensive ingredient, no culinary degree needed, just practical wisdom passed down from mothers who lived through the Depression and refused to let their children or themselves go hungry ever again. These meals fed widows living alone in quiet kitchens. They fed elderly couples stretching social security checks across 30-day months. They fed grandmothers who babysat grandchildren and needed to put something hot on the table without spending money they didn't have. Every dish on this list was designed with one purpose: keep people fed, keep people independent, and waste absolutely nothing in the process. Today, we call this vintage cooking or retro recipes or nostalgia content. Back then, it was simply called supper. No one thought twice about dumping a can of beans into a dish and covering it with cornbread batter and calling it dinner. No one apologized for serving tuna mixed with noodles and soup. No one felt ashamed of making vegetables the main course when meat was unaffordable. They cooked, they ate, they survived, and they did it all for penny. Which of these 60 dump and bake suppers will you make first? Drop the number in the comments below and tell us if your grandmother made any of these dishes. Share this with someone who needs to save money on groceries right now. Let's bring these forgotten recipes back where they belong, on our tables, in our kitchens, feeding our families for pennies just like they did 70 years ago.